Hello, I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the Department of Anglophone Studies in the University of Antananarivo, and today we're going to be talking about how to formulate strong research questions. Now, this is something where ideally you will be pondering research questions that interest you, things that you want to know the answer about well before you have to pick a topic. And part of shaping that internal conversation, that internal debate, involves understanding what kinds of things you are interested in doing, what kinds of things you have to do, what kinds of things you can do, as in can feasibly do given the time. And so we're going to be approaching this question, what makes a strong research question, through 5 different approaches. First, we're going to review some basic methodology, some terminology, some ways of framing the questions. Next, we're going to look at some do's and don'ts, things that will make it easier and more manageable in scope, more clear what you're trying to do, and things that will take you in the opposite direction, that will discourage you from doing. We're going to look at a sample assignment from my home institution, Abilene Christian University, about drafting research questions and see what kind of instructions the professor is giving. Then we're going to look at research questions in some published journal articles and some research questions in completed master's theses. So our goal here is to understand in a general sense what kinds of things a research question will be looking at in a more specific sense things that are helpful to do and things that are not helpful to do. Then we'll look at specific instructions given for how to do these things. And then we'll look at some published literature, both of journal articles and, in this case, master's theses that have been published at American universities. So you can see what kinds of questions other people were asking and able to answer in a reasonable period of time. So let's start with methodology. So there are 3 basic types of research methodologies, and although not every field uses these explicitly, they do fit into this sort of breakdown. So the first one we'll talk about is qualitative research. Now, qualitative research deals primarily with information that cannot be easily expressed using numbers. Not saying that it's impossible to do in numbers, but it's not easy. It doesn't really lend itself there, or that there's so much abstraction that you lose a lot of the important detail. Now, qualitative information is usually used to produce information on some specific case or instance that you're focusing on, that you're trying to study, and usually is being used when you have a hypothesis about something, and you're trying to find out, well, is there a basis for looking at this, or is there a way that we can understand this that will allow us to move forward on that? Now, some of the more common qualitative methodologies are autoethnography, and by the way, if you're looking at this right now, see if you can catch the typo there. Autoethnography. So, as a general reminder, when you are formulating your research questions or when you're working on anything else, make sure to run spell check quickly before you submit, before you present. So an autoethnography is a way of telling a story about why things are done the way they are, where you yourself, the researcher, are a featured voice. There are non-autoethnographies, where you are writing a story about a group of people, perhaps people living in a particular region or a community within a business or an area or an activity group, but where that question of what they do and why, that documenting that is key to your inquiry. A case study, you're fixating on one for a single case study, or several for a multiple case study, where you're drawing narrow barriers, where you have a restricted circle of things that you're looking at, and you're trying to understand what's going on in depth, usually with a particular application in mind. Like you're trying to assess this, okay, what are the practical lessons that we can apply, or the principles of leadership perhaps that are illustrated in this. Grounded theory is when you're trying to understand a process, and the purpose of your research is to produce a theory that can then be tested, validated, and otherwise developed. Narrative inquiry is focused primarily on storytelling, documenting what's going on with less of a focus on why or how or what that means compared to ethnography. And phenomenology, you're trying to understand something that's going on. And this phenomenology is really one of those things that usually gets done when you're trying to do the first study on something and try and frame the questions that would be asked in the next follow-up piece of research. Now, quantitative research, by contrast, deals primarily with information that can be expressed easily using numbers or other ways of coding. Now, quantitative research is usually not the first study on a topic. It's usually a follow-up after you've done some qualitative research where you've generated some hypotheses from your initial observation, and you're going to try and find out, okay, is there significant evidence that these hypotheses are true, that we can prove them, or at least disprove the null hypotheses. So, some of the examples of the types of research that do this: descriptive studies, casual comparative, quasi-experimental, correlational, and experimental. Now, these don't come up terribly often in the humanities. There are exceptions, but it's something that you're much more likely to be doing in the physical sciences or the social sciences. So we won't spend too much time on this right now because we're going to be looking at some examples of this in action, and that will explain much better than an abstract discussion what some of these things look like in practice. But in general, if we look at descriptive, the focus of descriptive quantitative research is, okay, let's document what's going on in largely numerical form. Casual comparative or quasi-experimental, well, trying to tease out the strength of connections without having an actual experiment going on with control groups and interventions and things like that. Correlational, we're looking at the mathematical or statistical relationships between things. And in a true experiment, we are trying to change specific things and see what results from changing those specific things. So, for example, in a true experiment, experimental quantitative research, you might have 2 or 3 groups of research participants, and you have one group where you don't do anything at all to them, another where you change one thing, and a second where you change another thing. And by being able to look at the differences between these groups and what you're giving them, or taking away as the case may be, you can get some statistical results that suggest whether or not there's a likely connection between these. All right. Now, mixed methods research combines qualitative and quantitative methodologies, and we do not recommend that you do that for a first research project. In fact, unless you've done significant research in qualitative and quantitative research before and done a mixed method study, I don't recommend that you do it for your second or third project either. This is the kind of thing where there are 2 conflicting impulses. The first impulse is the desire to do the best, most in-depth, most impactful research that you can. And the second is the practical acknowledgement that you probably want to graduate sooner rather than later. And one thing that mixed methods research is not is easier. And something it's definitely not is faster, because you have to not only do both qualitative and quantitative data collection, but you also have to do analysis for both of them, and you need to do the research for both sides and write about them in depth. And so that all adds up to a lot, and a lot to do when you're trying to graduate on a particular schedule. Now, you're encouraged and welcome to watch this video that I have linked here, where I talk about research methods section of a typical social sciences dissertation and go into more detail on how or why you might select particular things. But we're going to take a look right now at some types of quantitative research questions. And these are broad categories. We're going to look at some specific examples later, but broadly speaking, descriptive research questions, you're trying to summarize some characteristics of a population. What are things that they're doing? What are things that describe them? What are things that they have or are? Things like, how much do they have of this? How often do they do that? What percent of them meet some characteristics? Time, or what are they? Now, if a descriptive research question is about summarizing who these people are, a inferential research question is trying to make predictions or assessments about this group that we're looking at. What can we infer based on the data we've got about the larger group? Are these two different variables we're tracking related? Is there a statistically significant correlation between X and Y? Now, qualitative takes us in a different direction. Rather than focusing on just describing, in numerical terms, this is what's going on, a central tour or primary research question is usually asking something like, how does this group do this thing? Or how does this affect something else? Now, these should be big picture questions, because when we are looking at this, it should be something that is not a quick yes-no answer, and it shouldn't be something where you can just interview people and find the answer directly. It should be something larger, something more big picture. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts. And I'm not saying that these are ironclad, you can never change them. You always have to follow it. Saying we strongly suggest that in order to graduate in a timely fashion, to complete a manageable piece of research, that you ask questions that are clear and focused, that are concise and specific, complex, meaning that it requires some analysis and synthesis to answer, and arguable, meaning that we're not simply confirming well-known facts. It has to be something that's worthy of writing an article or a master's thesis, and that it is in some way designed to help answer that this the explorations to answer your questions are designed to produce information that will help address a problem. And what we call a problem, well, we've got a whole webinar on that, but problem understood in this sense. There's something that you want to do, or want to have happen, or want to change, that can't be done because we don't know enough, or don't know the right things, or don't know these strong enough in order to act on that. And this can take many forms, especially when you're doing humanities research, where there may be something where you're trying to understand a phenomenon, and that greater understanding is part of the end goal, and the problem is a gap in knowledge or a lack of prior focus. And that's fine. Now, the exception, the asterisk here, when you're looking for something that's arguable and not simply confirming well-known facts, there is a place in research for testing the generalizability of previous findings. Let me explain. You might do your preliminary study, and you have 20 research participants, and you find something and make some conclusions about that. Now, the next person can come along and say, okay, well, they did this preliminary study with 20 people, but they were all 20 people at the same company. I'm not sure if these results will hold true for a larger group or a group at another company. And so their research is looking and seeing, okay, do these findings hold true in another context or with a larger group of people or something like that? So it's not simply confirming, it's adding on that way. Now, you don't want to ask research questions that can't be answered. What is the purpose of life? That is, even if it's a conversation between God and you, it's basically impossible to prove. Now, if you were asking the question, well, what does this group of people believe is the meaning of life? Well, that's something you can answer. So you don't want to ask questions that are so broad that you can't answer them with your available time and resources. And that includes things that are simply impossible for humans, or impossible to do with verifiability, or things that could be done if you had a lot of resources, but you don't have enough time because there are other things you need to do in life, or you need to do something before you graduate, or before you need to pay tuition again, or whatever those restrictions might be. And you also want something that's not so narrow that it can be, as I said earlier, a yes-no answer, or something that you can have a research participant just tell you the answer and be like, oh, yeah, okay, let's done. Thanks for telling me. Let's go home now. No, it needs to be broader than that. And you must also avoid asking research questions that don't generate useful or important information. So at this point, we're going to take a look at an assignment. So this comes from the Research Methods in Family Therapy course at Abilene Christian University. So this is an assignment that asks you to develop research questions, and I've included this here as an artifact, as an example of one way to channel your thinking and look at, okay, what am I trying to do? What kinds of things do I want to answer? Now, this particular assignment begins with a preamble. It says, okay, review the guidelines for developing research questions in Chapter 7 of the book Research Design, and that there are specifically sections about different types of research questions. Now, one of the reasons to bring this up is that there are many resources out there to help you write research questions and to help you narrow down what kind of research questions to address the problem that you're going into. There are many that are free online, but we also have some in the main university library at the University of Antananarivo. Now, the instructions begin properly here. Write the following for the type of research study you are planning to propose. If you're proposing a qualitative study, write one central grand tour research questions and 2 to 3 sub-questions. Those sub-questions, or secondary research questions, by the way, are things that would help you answer the main question, that are perhaps even required for you to be able to answer the main question or questions. Now, if you're proposing a quantitative study, that means you're going to be writing descriptive or inferential questions. So, keep that in mind. The type of methodology that you choose is going to determine the types of questions that you can answer that are appropriate for answering with that methodology. And hopefully at this point you're saying, well, I'm not going to do a mixed method study, don't need to worry about that. But on the off chance that you are, well, if you are going to be proposing it, in this case, you'd want to be writing a question that incorporates the procedures and one the content. Okay, one is why are you using the mixed methods? What is essential for mixed methods for answering this question? And what's kind of the big picture? Well, where does this go from there? Now, in this particular assignment, it's teaching you to write research questions. So this is something that I would encourage you to do if you are brainstorming about topics, considering what interests you, because you'll get an idea from the questions that you write about what kind of research you would need to do to answer it. Now, you can see here that the criteria for this assignment asks for a different number of questions depending on the type of topic. And this is one particular assignment in a particular class at university, so don't feel that you must have exactly this number of questions, but it gives you a ballpark idea of, oh, yes, qualitative research often has more research questions. The quantitative research, it's going to depend on the kind of data that you're collecting and how many things make more sense as a big picture question versus those secondary research questions that you need to answer the big ones. All right, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to take a look at PLOS One. Now, PLOS One, it happens to be a high-impact open access journal. It's been running for a while. It started before open access was really something that people knew about in a large sense, and it has managed to attain a pretty high standard of content. And it's a high-impact journal, meaning that a lot of people read it, a lot of people cite things here, and it publishes research on a wide variety of scientific topics, which is helpful for us here because not everyone watching this may be interested in, say, education theory, or in literary analysis, or a behavioral research study, or whatever it should be. And so this has a wide variety of research. There's no password requirement. There is no login required. You can just go to the website and download the articles immediately as PDFs. No need for logging in, no need for subscribing. So let me go ahead and open this up. So here is the website for PLOS One. 15 years old now. Like I said, it's been doing this before things were cool. Now, as you can see, they're highlighting some research here on COVID-19. You've probably read plenty about that already, and are rather tired. So let's just take a look at some things here. See the variety of different disciplines. And also, we have a search function. So let's see what kind of research we have here on Madagascar. So if I type Madagascar into the search box, I get actually a lot more results than I was expecting. More than 2,000. Now, that's not necessarily having a focus just on Madagascar, but it is coming up in a lot of different areas. And so if you have a particular interest in one of these things that is coincided, say if you're environmental studies and you want to go look at the water, or you're looking at disease spread, and so you look at PLOS biology or PLOS pathogens, or going through one of these other sorting things. So I'm just going to go ahead and limit things to research article. And I'm going to go ahead and just look at some things here. So we'll go ahead and open up this article on dialects of Madagascar. So this is published about a year and a half ago, and it's a very interesting article. And what they did, they collected a data set with more than 12,000 terms, words mostly, that were collected during fieldwork before the pandemic, and they tried to figure out, among other things, what evidence do we have for how the Malagasy language formed and how it spread. Now, if we look at this, we have a table of contents of sorts here, and what we don't have is a section that says research question. Now, when you are looking at a published article, they may not have a specific section that says research question, and they might not even write out the research questions in question form. But we can usually figure out what they were trying to do. Now, if we look at the article, it says dialects of Madagascar. Okay, that gives us an idea. Now, we look at the abstract, the summary of the paper. We see that they describe the data that they used, how it was classified, and then we see what they were trying to determine. And so even though the questions aren't listed here, we can see based on what they're reporting what kinds of questions they were trying to ask. Okay, so they were trying this method and they wanted to see would it realistically reproduce the geography. So that's question number 1. What was the landing date? When did the ancestors of the Malagasy people land on the island? And is there a definition of diversity that makes sense for Madagascar given the data? And there may be other questions, but those are some of the big picture ones here. Now, if we look at this here, we find that we have some background information, more background information. This is basically summarizing what is known before. And then we have a list of, what did they do? And so there's a hypothesis that was tested. That people arrived in the second half of the first millennium of the Common Era. And we have their answer. Yes, they confirmed this dating by a new method. What else did they do? This is again a hypothesis where they're testing the hypothesis allowed them to answer the research question. Okay, they tested that hypothesis that colonization started in the southeast. All right. Now, there are other things here we could spend a lot of time, because it's a fascinating article. And the way that they chose to make the data accessible has some visuals that are pretty cool and really are a way of making sense of complex data, presenting it in an easy to understand fashion. And there's much we could do with that. But our purpose here is to look at the research questions. And so we've looked at this and determined that the article doesn't present the questions in question form, but it's certainly trying to answer some questions. And we were able to tease those out from looking at the early sections and the abstract. All right, so let's go back to PLOS One here. Now, here's a more, we'll call it hard sciences article. Possible fruit protein effects on primate communities in Madagascar and the Neotropics. All right, let's take a look at this one here. Now, we have a problem that they report. Okay, so there's a phenomenon that hasn't really been explored. And so they developed a hypothesis that, neotropical fruits have higher protein concentrations than fruits from Madagascar, and that the higher representation of frugivorous genera in the Neotropics is a link to high protein concentrations in fruit. So since there's this two hypotheses here, then the research questions, since you want to be testing those hypotheses, are going to be something like, do neotropical fruits have a higher protein concentration than fruits from Madagascar? And are higher representation of frugivorous genera in the Neotropics linked to high protein concentrations in fruits? All right, so if we look at the information here, see some charts, some maps, and the introduction. See, okay, here's what they're trying to do, to explain why there are more frugivorous taxa in the tropics in the New World compared to Madagascar. And then they unpack this in various forms. Now, again, this isn't something where they have helpfully put everything in a section research question. Some journals will require that, PLOS One does not. All right, now we'll go ahead and look at Let's go with primates as predictors of mammal community diversity. Now, a quick check here shows us that this one does give us their primary research question, here called their central question. How effectively do primates predict the pooled species richness of other mammalian taxa? And they were using lemurs to look at these different areas. Now, they have helpfully given us that question, and we can look at this and see, okay, let's go ahead and look at the results now. How did they answer that? And we see, here's their answer. Primates are effective predictors of non-primate mammal community diversity. Okay, all right. Now, I strongly recommend poking around, because the more samples that you look at of the kinds of things that you want to be doing, and the closer it is to your discipline or the type of inquiry you're doing, the easier it is to understand how this might relate or manifest in your own research. Speaking of which, let's take a look now at some master's theses. So again, this is a resource that is free to the public. All you need is internet access. You can download the manuscripts as PDFs. So this is the Electronic Theses and Dissertations Archive run by Abilene Christian University, my home institution. Most research universities in the United States now have something like this, where people can, without having to pay money or without having to sign up, access published theses and dissertations. So we're going to go ahead and take a look here. So when we get to this, you can see, all right, there are 437 in this database. Yeah, they read a fair number of things downloaded here. So we could go ahead and look at things that are very recent here, and we can look further back if we really want. But let's start by looking at, okay, what can we do here? We could do searches. We could look at how to sort this. I would like to just take a peek at a couple things really quick. So I'm going to zoom in here, and let's take a look at some of these different studies here. And let's say that I am looking at, teachers' perspectives of restorative disciplinary practices. That sounds like something that's probably going to be qualitative. Let's take a look at that. African-American teachers' experience of becoming a teacher in Ohio, a case study. Oh, case study research, great. The relationship between resilience and social support among college students. That very likely would be a quantitative, so we'll look at that too. And then, if you want something that is more literary studies, I think this Remembering Jacob one will be in that vein. All right, so let's take a look here at what we've got here. So this first one here is a doctoral dissertation in the field of educational leadership. This next one here is also a doctoral dissertation in the field of educational leadership. This is a master's thesis in psychology. And this is a master's thesis in theology. All right, let's take a look here and see if we can find another thing. All right, this looks like it might be something in the public health or nursing field. And let's see. Let's look at this one here. So this one here, this is a nursing thesis. or capstone project. And this last one is a social work thesis. So we have a variety of different levels here. And you can download the manuscript just by going to download here. That will open things as a PDF, a searchable PDF I should add. Now, when you are looking at something, we always want to make sure that we understand what we're looking for. And a great way to make sure that it is what you want is to look at the abstract. And here we see, oh, they were using surveys of incoming freshmen and transfer students. Okay, that's probably qualitative. Probably quantitative, because we're dealing with surveys and the results from this can be tabulated and have statistical analyses on them. And while surveys can have written things, they're usually questions where people are picking from different things, especially with that quantity of participants. So if we look for the research questions, we see comes up in a few different places. They had their survey questions that they referred to. And if we look here, table of contents, we see there's a brief introduction. They describe the current study, survey methods, procedure. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. We find so if we look through this, we'll find that this is more descriptive in nature. It's saying, okay, here's what we found. And there's less of the trying to answer questions and more saying, okay, well, here's what's going on here. So when we talk about preliminary research, this is more of the preliminary research sort. They've collected information on what students filling out this survey have said, and there's less of a emphasis on, say, changing things. We do notice that the students here all participated in an intervention. They took this alcohol edu thing, and they completed a pre and post survey. This is the survey we're looking at. So you can understand the research question is, the primary research question is something in the realm of trying to find out, okay, so did their perspectives change and how based on their experiences with the intervention? All right, let's take a look now about something that is more in the science area and generally tends to have more formally written out questions. Again, acknowledging that sometimes the questions in the published product you're looking at are more implicit than explicit, and that's fine. We just want to find out what's required for what we're doing. Oh, another thing. When you are looking at a well-written abstract, it will tell you usually what kinds of data they were looking at. Sometimes will explicitly say qualitative or quantitative, but not always. Okay. And then when we look at this one here, so we see we have this Master's of Science thesis in psychology. And we see 191 college students in a course completed 3 measures assessing these things. And they tell us the hypotheses that they were trying to prove or disprove. Social support increases, resilience increases, that as resilience increases, distress goes down, and that is social support increases even during the college age students' confinement during the pandemic, that their stress would decrease as their support went up. And we have another hypothesis here, and then they start reporting on the results. Alright, so let's take a look at this one here. And if we do a word search for question, we find it brings us to the consent form. And in this case, because of the discipline here, because this is a nursing thing, they're calling it PICO questions instead of research questions. PICO is a particular formula that's used a lot in nursing for formulating questions. But again, it's a research question, just a particular genre of it. So if we head on down to the relevant page, so they're giving us first the breakdown of the different elements in the PICO question. So the P is the population of interest, the larger group that you're studying. In this case, exotic dancers in part of Texas. I is the intervention, the thing that they're introducing and seeing, does this make a change in something. Comparison is how they're going to be determining whether or not something has changed. In this case, the people who go to the intervention, who participate in it, they ask some questions through looks like a survey, before they take the intervention and after. And then we have the outcome, what they're expecting will come out of it, which is the people who do the training will know more about certain things. And with that, we see that they haven't presented these in question form so much, because they were following the formula and saying, okay, here's what we're trying to check. That's one way that it's done. We have the main hypothesis here. Let's take a look at the relationship between resilience and social support. So it turns out that this is another case where the research questions are more implicit than explicit. The first hypothesis was that as the social support increases, then resilience will also increase. So basically the research question is this hypothesis disproved or proved? And so on for the 4 different hypotheses that they have here. Then we have the answer saying, okay, we found a statistically significant correlation for that, or we didn't. Right, that's fine. It's a type of qualitative research. But if you are trying to answer that yourself, it's very helpful to know what the actual questions are, even if it doesn't make its way into the ultimate final document as published. Because some journals, for stylistic reasons, they prefer more of a narrative flow that doesn't happen to include that. Alright, now this one here tells us in the abstract what the research questions were. What were African American teachers' lived experiences of becoming a teacher in Ohio? Okay, yep, that's definitely something we're going to have to look at the answers from the group rather than just what one person said. How do these teachers perceive the obstacles and catalysts of becoming and remaining teachers in Ohio? Yep. How do African American teachers view diversity in the teaching force? What policies do they recommend for improving the recruitment or hiring procedures? And what recommendations do they have for retaining similar teachers at schools? So we have 5 questions, and none of these have yes or no answers. It's going to be much more complex than that. And if we scroll down to where they discuss the research questions, we have a recap of the 5 questions here. And they say, okay, the central question was used to explore the... here we are. So these are the secondary research questions used to answer the primary research question, which is, what were African American teachers' experiences becoming teachers in Ohio, and what suggestions do they have for improving the hiring process? And with such a wide-ranging question as that, yeah, we're going to need some more specific questions to answer it. So this is really well laid out there. And if we look at this, okay, what were is not saying what were the experiences of all African American teachers in the state. It's, what are the experiences of the teachers that they've recruited for the study. All right, how do they perceive things? Okay, yep, that's definitely the kind of thing that you can get from interviews. How do they view diversity in the teaching force? Same thing. What policies do they recommend? Okay, so there's going to be some bit of asking and analyzing or looking for patterns. And what recommendations do they have for retaining it? All right, very similar. All right, now we can see here that there's discussion of the answers for each of the different research questions here. So they're starting with answering the secondary questions, that's the ones numbered 1 to 5, answering them in order because these are, after all, designed to be answered to help you answer the overall research question, the primary research question. You can see that they're listing which participants responded to in which way to different prompts, and they're discussing further the implications of these findings. And then they even take some of the information collected in the interviews and collecting it into themes. Say, oh, yes, okay. Unanimously, they said that the license test made it unreasonably hard to become a certified teacher. And you could go through and look at their explanation of the significance of the different results for everything. By the way, if you came to the first workshop in the series, and you want to know about limitations and delimitations, we have a discussion here that talks about how one limit was that they didn't have too many people, and so that this may limit how they can generalize, so that they can apply the findings to a larger population, that there are time constraints involved, and that there's some potential for people to not say their true or full thoughts, and that some recommendations came out of it. And again, a good research question helps you, when you answer it, helps you address some problem that you have perceived. And in this case, based on the answers there, they have produced 4 policy recommendations. So all in all, that's an excellent set of research questions with hypotheses that they were testing, and then leading to concrete recommendations. All right, we're about the hour right now, so this is a good time for us to do a quick recap of what we've looked at. So we started off with a review of the basic research methodologies. We talked about some suggested do's and don'ts for formulating your research questions. We looked at an assignment that asks students to write research questions. Looked at some published journal articles where the research questions happen to be more implicit than explicit. And we finished by looking at a number of graduate theses and dissertations for their research questions and how that connected to other elements of the research. So I hope that you've gotten a better understanding of what research questions are, what they're trying to do, and what makes a strong research question. And we'll be back soon for another installment in this series.